Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to share with you today the bold plans and lofty goals of the Duterte administration. We now have the necessary conditions and the right formula to successfully transform the country into the Asian tiger that it is capable of becoming. For quite some time now, the Philippine economy has enjoyed strong macroeconomic fundamentals that enables it to weather external headwinds. Combining this with crucial policy reforms and the trademark political will and efficient implementation of this administration, I am confident that we can successfully lay the groundwork for a robust, wealth-generating, and wealth-distributing Philippine economy. We are committed in promoting rapid and inclusive growth. Our plan is not only to sustain growth at 7 to 8% in the medium term, but also to reduce poverty to 14% from 21.6% in 2015. During the last 10 years, poverty has been cut by 0.5% on an annual basis. We intend to reduce it by 1.25 to 1.5% every year. So that's a big challenge. And by the time we step down, we envision the Philippine economy to be in high middle income territory. So our compass is the Philippine Development Plan and the 0+10-point socioeconomic agenda. And in line with our development blueprint, we have put in place a fiscal policy that will facilitate the achievement of our medium-term goals. So first, we have increased the planned deficit from 2 to 3% of GDP. 1% of GDP, that's the difference, gave me an additional 150 to 200 billion pesos per year. So that's the purpose for the higher deficit. And we plan to sustain this level until 2022. And this is to finance our infrastructure needs and also our investment in human capital. This implies a deficit target of 482 billion in 2017, rising to 777 billion in 2022. Our borrowings will have an 80-20 mix in favor of domestic borrowing. So we borrow more domestically. There's a lot of money floating around, so we borrow more domestically. And this financing mix also will minimize our exposure to foreign exchange fluctuations and enable us to better manage our debt. Now, to the faint-hearted and the fiscal conservatives, let me assure you that our budget strategy is sound, appropriate, and sustainable. Despite the deficit trajectory, the debt-to-GDP ratio will continue to fall as we expect GDP growth to outpace the rise in debt accumulation. The debt-to-GDP ratio is expected to shrink from 42% in 2016 to 36% in 2022. With this debt profile, we earn the envy of most developed and developing countries in the world, facing much higher debt to GDP ratios. Now, our borrowings will be complemented by increased revenue collection resulting from improved tax administration and the new revenue measures proposed by the Department of Finance. This will raise the revenue effort, defined as revenues as percent of GDP, to 15.2% of GDP in 2017 and is steadily increasing to 17.7% in 2022. The new revenue measures will contribute roughly 1% of GDP annually over the medium term. The simple truth is that we need the expansionary fiscal policy to fuel our huge investments on public infrastructure and social services, aspects of the Philippine economy that require urgent attention. Analysts and academicians have long cited our poor and crumbling infrastructure as a constraint to growth and investments. Poor infrastructure hampers economic productivity, trade mobility, and accessibility of public services. One only needs to observe and experience the painstakingly slow Metro Manila traffic to arrive at such a conclusion. Quantified, the traffic congestion cost the economy at least 2.4 billion daily, or 876 billion yearly, according to a JICA study in 2014. This is a staggering loss for the country. It is for these reasons that infrastructure development will be the top priority of the Duterte administration. As mentioned in the previous infrastructure session, we will spend 8 to 9 trillion, let me repeat that, 8 to 9 trillion in public infrastructure for the next 6 years, from 2017 to 2022, to make up for past neglect and to realize what we call the golden age of infrastructure. For fiscal year 2017 alone, this year, 847 billion, or 5.3% of GDP, is allocated for infrastructure development. The annual infrastructure spending will be ramped up, reaching as much as 7.4% of GDP in 2022. Mind you, for the last 50 years, the average infrastructure spending as percent of GDP has not gone up beyond 3%. It's averaged between 2 to 3%. This ambitious spending pattern will allow us to construct and modernize our roads, bridges, airports, seaports, flood control, and irrigation systems, among other facilities. My colleagues in the cabinet will explain all these projects to you later on. The government will use all possible modalities to forward the golden age of infrastructure, including local funding, public-private partnerships, and official development assistance. We will stay true to our promise of build, build, build. However, our preferred modality is the hybrid type, where the government selects, finances, and constructs the project, of course using the private sector through competitive bidding, and once done, will be the same to the private sector for operations and maintenance. We feel that through this modality, we can afford to provide essential public services to citizens at more affordable prices and in a sustained way. Now, another pressing concern is developing our young population into an agile and competent workforce. In an aging world, we have a young population whose median age is about 23 years. And we recognize that this can be an asset or a liability. Our best bet in maximizing our growth potential is to invest heavily in our greatest resource, which is our people. This is why 40% of the 2017 budget is allocated to social services, education, healthcare, social protection, among other things. Some of the major programs that we are currently funding include, of course, the K-12 program, conditional cash transfer program, the National Health Insurance program, and other also housing program. And we will not stop there. The government will sustain this level of support. In fact, the share of social sector's expenditures to GDP is planned to increase from 8.5% this year to 9.2% of GDP by 2022. We must take advantage of our demographic window, and this will largely depend on the productivity and quality of our labor force. This obviously requires higher investments on human capital development. Given our bold plans and lofty goals, implementation reforms are necessary to translate resources into value-adding programs and projects. But our policy reforms will amount to nothing if they remain mere concepts and ideals. Much like the President, we, the economic managers, give value to efficient and timely execution. Government spending must facilitate economic growth. This is basic economics. This means utilizing the national budget to the fullest extent authorized by law. Hence, we will continue to guard against underspending, the Waterloo of the previous administration. This is especially so since the budget for 2017 and future budgets will be bigger. Interestingly, last year's, meaning 2016, spending pattern shows some promise. Underspending has slowed down to 3.6%, driven by strong spending for infrastructure and other capital outlays. This is significantly less than 13.3% and 12.8% in 2014 and 2015, respectively. So once our budget reforms finally gain traction, we expect government spending rate to improve. And so below, I will just mention some of the budget reforms we have introduced. Number one, and this is not really a new concept. When I was appointed budget secretary under President Estrada, I adopted what you see is what you get concept of budget release. Because we spend one whole year preparing the budget, 6 months with the executive and 6 months in Congress. And after the passage of the budget, no department can spend a centavo until the Department of Budget released a document called Advice of Allotment. I said, that's crazy. We spend one whole year preparing the budget authorized by the Congress and signed by the President. Why can't we spend the budget? So I said, the budget itself is the release document. I adopted that, 16 years ago. And it worked. But as soon as you know, the term of Mr. Estrada was kind of truncated, right? After Mr. Estrada left, they went back to the old system. I am putting it back. So the budget document is the release document. So that's the major change. We are also, well, revising. They always blame the procurement system. Well, they're talking to somebody who's been there in government, and this has been my passion, procurement reform. And this is a good law. Many international organizations, World Bank, ADB, IMF, they said this is the best law in the world. Okay, so they have used it as an excuse for their inefficiency. And so when we took over, I revised the implementing rules and regulations, and so now we're already on track. We will also geotag infrastructure projects to curb ghost projects. So we'll use drones and, of course, the internet or the satellite to monitor projects. So what else? All right, budget reform bill. We are adopting that to modernize our budget system. We are shifting from the usual 2-year obligation budgeting to just 1 year. You got to spend your money within 1 year, all right? So that also will speed up the process. On the revenue side, I sympathize with Secretary Dominguez here because this tax reform is taking so long, okay? This tax reform is a good one, okay? It's been supported by former finance secretaries, former NEDA secretaries, by the business sector, and so I don't understand why this is taking so long. But I think, given the push that we will exert, I'm optimistic that this will be passed within the year. Within the year. The tax reform will not only make the tax system simpler, fairer, and more efficient. It will also invite more investments and put more money in the pockets of 99% of the population. Among the reforms included in the first tax reform package are lower personal income tax rates with fewer brackets, because our tax system, personal income tax system, does not compare with the rest of the ASEAN 10. Broader value-added tax base, adjusted excise taxes on oil and automobiles. As a country, we should not get used to cheap oil, okay? Because we do not produce oil in this country. Inclusive of the tax administration reforms, the first tax package will net $206.8 billion in revenues for 2018. At the same time, the tax reform, as formulated by Secretary Dominguez, targeted transfers will be put in place to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable sectors that will be affected by the tax reform. So in essence, the tax reform package is a win-win proposition. It is a reform package that we wish our legislators would support enthusiastically. And I'm optimistic that our legislators will see the light and pass into law the first package before the end of the year. Now, clearly, the Duterte administration is serious in its pursuit for real change in the economy and the living standards of the Filipino people. Right now, our optimism is shared not only by the private sector, but also by the international community. After all, the Philippines is expected to be one of the fastest growing economies in the fastest growing region in the world. Our supportive fiscal policy, in tandem with sound macroeconomic fundamentals and socioeconomic interventions, will only boost our development prospects. Soon, we will get a glimpse of what a modern Philippines would look like: a first world infrastructure, better trained labor force, more decent jobs and higher wages, and effective and accountable governance. In closing, let me urge you to come and join us in this lofty goal of having a better, safer, fairer, more beautiful, and more prosperous Philippines. Thank you, and mabuhay.